Chapter 6, Parental Self-Control. Mr. and Mrs. Oliver looked at each other and shook their heads in puzzlement. Not 10 minutes before, their 16-year-old daughter Amy was explaining precisely how she managed to land a much sought-after position by impressing her employer with how mature she was. Now, she was crying uncontrollably because her brother had used her shampoo. Parents of teenagers know that adolescence is a tumultuous time in which the teenage child can swing from toddler to adult, from sweet to sour, from logical to irrational, and back again, all within the span of a day or an hour. These changes can be intense and frequent, and too few parents know exactly why they happen. In the teenage years, young people are attempting to resolve all the conflicts they have previously experienced in their lives, especially with their parents. Although teenagers are not conscious of this desire to resolve old conflicts, the drive within them to do so is so strong that it appears to others that the teenagers have chosen a deliberate course of action. Before he can comfortably and normally grow away from his parents and become responsibly independent, a teenager must clear his past, so to speak, of problems and conflicts he's had with people, and especially with his parents. When my daughter Carrie was 13, I noticed one day that her attitude toward me was one of irritability and some hostility. I asked her, "Please tell me, honey, have I done anything that has upset or hurt you?" Without hesitation, she recounted an incident that occurred 6 years previously. We had been riding in a station wagon. My wife and I were in the front seat, the other children in the middle seat, and Carrie with a friend in the back seat. All the kids were throwing popcorn at each other. Because it was distracting me as I was driving, I yelled for them to stop. Carrie exclaimed that I had embarrassed her by screaming at her friends. Yes, I remembered the incident, but never guessed that it had affected her so deeply. At that moment, Carrie had psychologically regressed to a 7-year-old level in order to deal with that particular conflict. After she revealed this encounter to me, and I noted the anger in her voice, I told her that I honestly had not realized the embarrassment and pain I had caused her. When I told her I was sorry and asked her forgiveness, she was immediately relieved and became her 13-year-old self again. This regression and advance in psychological age is one reason why early teenagers are so unpredictable and sometimes difficult to understand. Parents should react to them according to the age they are exhibiting at that time. For instance, let's say your early adolescent approaches you with a highly sophisticated statement such as, "Dad, what do you think of the Middle East crisis? I wonder if the displaced Palestinian Arab families should be entitled to return to their homes and be a normal part of the Israeli nation." After a couple of gulps, you are able to communicate with him on that exact level and discuss the issue. But that same teenager may be back 30 minutes later with what appears to be a 2-year-old temper tantrum. What do? Right. Relate to him as would be appropriate with a 2-year-old having a temper tantrum. As you can easily see, this takes real flexibility on your part to change your level of communication rapidly. This is why a good, flexible youth counselor who's dealing with several early adolescents can be utterly exhausted at the end of the day. It is extremely important that you as parents exhibit emotional self-control. Emotional overreaction will hurt your relationship with your teenager in several ways. 1, excessive and uncontrolled anger will make it difficult for your teenager to come to you when his emotional tank needs refilling. 2, emotional overreaction tends to cause your adolescent to respect you less, a very natural response to someone who lacks self-control. 3, losing your cool tends to push your teen into the influence of others, especially peers. But how do you keep yourself in good condition emotionally? How do you maintain self-control? The most common problems which adversely affect an adult's ability to control anger are depression, fatigue, and anxiety. Most people are ineffective in preventing depression because they do not realize how closely it's related to how much time they spend with people and how much time they spend alone. In other words, time balance. For the sake of your own mental health and for that of your teenager, you need to determine what percentage of your time should be spent with people and how much should be spent alone. This differs with every person, and your own ratio can change with times and seasons and circumstances. The quality of each kind of time is important also, especially the time alone, which should be emotionally refreshing for you. This may mean reading a good book, hiking, walking, exercising alone, praying, or meditating. Television seldom fills this need. In fact, TV seems to leave most people even more emotionally drained. Emotional stability and self-control do not just happen. You must prepare yourself to cope with emotional strain and frustration. A normal teenager will bring forth both. To maintain a healthy relationship with your teenager and keep communications open, you need to be in good control of yourself, especially of your anger. We all overreact at times, and if we don't do it too often, it is possible to produce a positive situation out of a negative one. This may involve apologizing to a son or daughter for overreacting and asking for forgiveness. Honey, I'm sorry I overdid it and yelled yesterday. What you did was wrong, but I overreacted and should have handled it in a calmer way. Will you forgive me? This approach not only prevents many disasters, but can actually strengthen and sweeten a parent-teenager relationship. However, if you overreact too often or in extreme ways, simply saying you're sorry and asking forgiveness will not work. It could even lower you in your child's eyes. The more pleasant you are with your teenager, the firmer you can afford to be in setting limits and in discipline. Likewise, the more unpleasant you are with your teenager, the less firm you can afford to be. How can you really expect good self-control from your teenager if you do not have it yourself? Energy, preparation, self-discipline, and self-control are needed if you're going to be pleasant in the midst of unpleasant but normal adolescent strivings. Anger is difficult to control if your spiritual life is not sound. I believe a healthy spiritual life is one in which communications are open between you and God. How is this done? First, make sure you have a clean heart by asking God to search your heart and convict you of any wrong he finds there. Next, confess these wrongs and obtain God's forgiveness and cleansing. This clears the channel of communication between you and God. Now you are ready to draw close to him and he to you. God is then able to fill your emotional and spiritual tank. He does this by being with you, close to you, listening, guiding, comforting, and reassuring you with his promises and love. Your ability to handle anger is influenced by many things, most of which have little or nothing to do with your teenager. One of these is your physical condition. Employing good common sense, a regular exercise program, good diet, recreation, a healthy spiritual life can go a long way toward preventing depression. Unfortunately, not all depression can be prevented. Many people are biochemically or hereditarily prone to depression. If a person has done all in his power to prevent depression, yet becomes depressed, he should seek help, not only for his own sake, but also for the sake of his family. A moderately to severely depressed parent simply cannot handle a normal teenager well. The relationship between parent and child will suffer, and so will the teenager himself. Bob was a 17-year-old boy whom I saw because of drug usage, poor grades, and a defiant attitude. When I saw him alone, he was a calm, polite boy and exceptionally easy to communicate with. I felt he was truthful when he stated that he did not like his behavior and wanted to change. He said that he had been trying to make a change in his behavior. Of course, I wanted to check out Bob's perceptions and see if they were accurate. So I asked Bob's parents to join us. Bob's father was an extraordinarily angry man. He immediately made a grossly hostile attack about Bob's terrible and unacceptable behavior. His anger and the ferocity of his remarks continued and even increased. Bob made no response, but deep, painful anger was obviously welling up within him. Finally, Bob's mother tried to intervene by telling the father that Bob's behavior had been good recently and that she could not understand why he was so angry. The father not only ignored the mother's pleas, but used Bob's behavior as an excuse to rid himself of excessive anger. When I talked to the father alone, I learned the real cause of his frustration. He was having severe problems at work, was extremely depressed, could not sleep well, could hardly eat, tired easily, and felt life was not worth living. Bob was the only safe place to ventilate his misery. I don't know which one made my heart ache most, Bob, his mother, or his father. It is a common thing for teenagers to be receptacles of parents' displaced anger. Teenagers often tend to put pressure on us, make us tense, upset, and angry. Therefore, it sometimes seems justifiable to dump all accumulated anger on them. This is so dangerous. Nothing else cuts off parent-adolescent communications the way poorly controlled anger does. We never really grow out of the need to be loved and cared for. These needs may be gradually taken over by other people in adult life. But during the years when our children are dependent on us, we parents must always stand available and ready to love and nourish them whenever we're needed, especially during the teenage years. Chapter 7, Teenage Anger. Many parents assume that anger in a child is bad or abnormal, and that expression of it should be suppressed or not allowed. This is a dangerous error. We are instructed in Scripture to train up a child in the way he should go, to educate him according to his life requirements. One of the most important areas in which a child, especially a teenager, needs training is in how to handle anger. The feeling of anger is not bad or good in itself. Anger is normal and occurs in every human being. The problem is not the anger itself, but in managing it. And this is where most people have problems. I believe it is imperative to understand the different ways to handle anger and to know which ways are better or worse. Let's start with what I consider the absolute worst way to handle anger: passive-aggressive behavior. I generally avoid using professional terms, but this one term I strongly recommend your knowing. Passive-aggressive behavior is an expression of anger that gets back at a person indirectly. A few examples of this are procrastination, dawdling, stubbornness, intentional inefficiency, and so-called forgetfulness. The subconscious purpose of passive-aggressive behavior is to upset the parents or parent figures and to make them angry. It is important to know that the passive-aggressive child does not do these things consciously or purposefully. They are part of an unconscious process of which he is not aware, and into which he has been forced by his parents. I've seen this unhealthy way of handling anger cause teenagers to run the gamut, from making poor grades to using drugs, becoming pregnant, committing crimes, and attempting suicide. More complexly, I have seen teenagers turn their unresolved anger onto themselves to cause psychosomatic problems such as headaches, ulcers, and skin problems. Passive-aggressive behavior is very common. Why? Because most people do not understand anger or know what to do with it. They feel that anger is somehow wrong or sinful and should be disciplined out of the child. This is a serious misunderstanding, because the feeling of anger is normal and has been encountered by every person who has ever been born. If, when your child becomes angry and you spank him or yell at him, "Stop that kind of talk, I will not allow it," what can the child do? Only two things. He can disobey you and continue to talk that way, or obey you and stop talking that way. If he chooses the latter and ceases to express his anger, the anger will not go away. The child will simply suppress the anger into his subconscious, where it will remain unresolved and waiting to be expressed later through inappropriate or passive-aggressive behavior. Another mistake some parents make related to expression of anger is the inappropriate use of humor. I recently visited a family where the father had an uncommonly humorous wit. Whenever his wife or one of his teenagers began expressing an unpleasant feeling, he would come up with a hilarious statement. Consequently, none of the teenagers in that family could deal with anger and resorted to passive-aggressive means of expressing it indirectly. Whenever the boy would experience frustration or anger-provoking situations, he would have severe headaches. The girl manifested her anger indirectly by voluntarily helping her mother with housework, but doing such a poor job that she often caused the mother more work than if she had not helped at all. Passive-aggressive behavior easily becomes an ingrained habitual pattern which can last a lifetime. If a child or teenager avoids honestly and openly dealing with anger in an appropriate manner, he may use passive-aggressive techniques in every relationship. This can affect his relationships later with spouse, children, work, associates, and friends. This brings to mind a 39-year-old woman named Margaret. She was born and raised in a Christian home. Unfortunately, her parents believed that a child should not be permitted to express anger. So she was never trained how to properly handle or resolve it. Consequently, she developed into an individual whose overall behavior pattern was designed to upset her parents. Her whole life was aimed at doing the exact opposite of what her parents would want. Her behavior patterns are unconscious and out of her awareness. Consciously, she thinks of herself as a well-meaning Christian who earnestly desires to live a proper lifestyle. However, she has had one affair after another with married men. She has been indicted for embezzlement and fraud. Margaret is an enigma to herself. Hers is a wasted life of self-abasement and self-destruction, because her primary purpose in living is to behave in ways which are just the opposite of what her parents want her to be. Scripture instructs us to train a child in the way he should go. Forcing a child to suppress anger and not to deal with it properly is training him in the way he should not go. It is crucial to train a child in the proper way to handle anger. This is done by teaching him to resolve the anger, not to suppress it. There are many ways to express anger. The more immature a person is, the more immaturely he will express his anger. Children tend to express anger immaturely until trained to do it otherwise. A teenager cannot be expected to automatically express his anger in the best, most mature way. But this is what parents are expecting when they simply tell their teen not to get mad. Parents must train teenagers to take one step at a time in learning to deal with anger. The anger ladder is designed to illustrate the different steps or levels of maturity in expressing anger, and to help parents see that a teenager must be trained to progress from one rung or level of maturity to the next as he expresses his anger more and more appropriately. A 15-rung anger ladder is provided in the book. For purposes of this tape, we will deal with 6 major levels of anger. Level 6. As we discussed before, passive-aggressive behavior is the worst way to express anger. Level 5. A slightly better way to express anger is to be utterly out of control behaviorally in such a way that the person in a fit of rage actually destroys property and/or is violent toward another person. As bad as this may sound, passive-aggressive behavior is worse. Why? Because rageous behavior is much easier to deal with, correct, and prevent than passive-aggressive behavior. Level 4. A somewhat better way to express anger is to be in a fit of rage, but maintaining enough self-control to prevent property destruction and personal violence. The outburst is confined to yelling, screaming, or cursing in such a way as to verbally hurt someone, perhaps with name-calling or accusatory remarks. Level 3. The next better way to handle anger is uncontrollably ventilating it verbally, but without seeking to hurt anyone verbally, as with name-calling or criticizing. In this situation, the anger is directed not only toward the source of the anger, but toward anyone who happens to be around. As primitive and poor as this method is, it is better than any we have mentioned yet. Level 2. A somewhat better way to handle anger is to ventilate it unpleasantly, perhaps by yelling and screaming, but confining the remarks to the provoking issue, and if possible, toward the person provoking the anger. Level 1. The best way to express anger is to do it as pleasantly and rationally as possible and toward the person one is angry with. You hope that the person receiving the anger will respond in an equally mature way, attempt to understand the other's position, and that the two can resolve the issue. This takes a great deal of maturity on both sides. Few people ever come to this point of maturity in their lives. Each rung on the anger ladder represents a progressively better way to express anger. You want to train your child to take one step at a time, to go up one rung at a time. How do you do this? As parents, you should be good examples in the proper expression of anger. Also, you can expect your teenager to become angry at times. Instead of forbidding him to become angry or overreacting to his anger, you need to meet him where he is in handling his anger and train him from there. First, determine what improvement you want for your teenager. Then, find a time soon after you both have calmed down and the atmosphere is pleasant. At this best of possible moments, compliment and praise your teenager in the areas of expressing his anger which he did correctly. Then, ask your teenager to correct that one selected aspect which you want changed. Let me clarify one point of possible confusion. It is in verbal expression of anger that you need to train your teenager so that he learns to handle it better. I'm not encouraging permissiveness in behavior. You must remain firm in not allowing your teenager to behave inappropriately. Limit setting regarding behavior must be firm and consistent. This distinction between verbal and behavioral expressions of anger is critical. My 13-year-old David was overloaded with homework one day. He arrived home at about 3:30 that afternoon, and except for 10 minutes for supper, he was still working on academics at 11:30 that night. He also had a book report due in a few days, and he told his mother, "Mom, I think I'll use this book for my book report." His mother looked at the book and replied, "No, David, you can't use that book because it's the same one you used last year." David said, "I know, but I can make another book report on it and won't have to read a new book." "I'm sorry, David," his mother replied. "That wouldn't be right. You have to read another book." David got mad and answered his mother in a loud, angry voice. "Okay, I'll read it. Just help me find another book and I'll read it. Okay, I'll read another book." My first reaction was a typical one toward a child who was verbally ventilating anger in an unpleasant, loud way. I felt anger rising within me. My first thought was, how dare he talk to his mother that way? I'll show him that he can't get away with being nasty like that. But fortunately, I remembered a previous event. 3 days before, I became so infuriated at a man, and at church, mind you, that I called him a liar. Who handled his anger better, David or I? I realized that David had managed his anger better than I. He directed his anger at its source, his mother. He didn't bring up unpleasant subjects or previous grievances. He simply stated that he would read another book. Who can improve on that? The only thing David did wrong was to speak loudly to his mother. Not many people, mature adults included, can beat that. After we all calmed down, David went to bed. During our usual nighttime ritual, here's a good example where nighttime rituals pay off, and after we had prayed together, I said to David, "I was very proud of the way you handled your anger tonight. You didn't take it out on your brother or the dog. You didn't throw anything or sulk or say anything wrong. You spoke directly to your mother without trying to hurt her with names or criticism. You simply said you would read another book. That's great. The only thing you did wrong was to yell at your mother." The effect was great. David felt relieved that I wasn't angry with him, but also felt very bad about yelling at his mother. The next day, he apologized to her. When your teenager expresses anger directly, be glad. The more he uses verbalizations to express his anger, the better it is. Then determine where your teen is functioning on the anger ladder. Determine in what ways he is expressing anger appropriately and in what ways he's being inappropriate. You want to train your teen in the way he should go. First, praise him for appropriate ways he is expressing anger. Then, you can talk to him about one of the inappropriate ways he is using, like name-calling, asking him to correct it. While most parents expect their children to handle anger maturely with no training, you are training your child to gradually go up the anger ladder one rung at a time. In some cases, it is impossible to resolve anger. For example, when the person provoking the anger is inaccessible. At these times, the teenager must learn other appropriate ways to ventilate the anger, like exercise, talking it over with a mature person, using diversion, such as an enjoyable activity, or spending time alone in a relaxed manner. Another way to train a teenager to handle his anger is to teach the art of preventing certain types of anger cognitively. This means using active intellectual reasoning to reduce the anger. You see immature ways of handling anger every day. You see a wife and husband yelling, screaming, and cursing at each other. You see the wife or husband having an affair to get back at the other. You see an employee doing poor work to undermine the employer's interests. 60 to 80% of problems in any organization are personnel related, because so few people learned how to deal with anger maturely. Most are very good at hiding it superficially when dealing face-to-face with others, but out it comes later in inappropriate ways. One of the most important things to understand about anger, whether we're dealing with employees, unions, government, or teenagers, is that it is bound to occur. It can result from any human interaction. The next important fact is that it will tend to build up and become more and more difficult to control, even explosive, if not dealt with. The more difficult it is to control, the more destructive it may become. Therefore, we must find ways to either nip it in the bud if the anger is based on misunderstanding, or to see that the anger is ventilated slowly and then resolved if it is justified. Such control does not come naturally to anyone. The maturity that comes with managing anger appropriately must be learned through much time and practice. Chapter 8, From Parent Control to Self-Control. As a child moves into the teenage years, discipline and training need to gradually change from a parent control basis to a parent trust basis, in which privileges and freedom depend on trustworthiness. Parents should work to make this transition as smooth and non-traumatic as possible. In order to accomplish this, you must first accept the fact that this drive for independence is normal. Eventually, your child should become quite independent of you, whether you like it or not. What you want to be able to do is to control the rate of this gain of independence, gauging it on his rate of maturity. The best indicator you have in doing this is the degree to which you can trust your child and his ability to control his behavior. Your teen will likely test your limits of control as well as your love for him. So naturally, your great concern is where to set the limits. Should you make them fair, broad, and reasonable, or should you be very strict? It's important to remember that the normal teenager will test and sometimes even break your limits or rules regardless of where you place them. Common sense, then, indicates that since it's in the makeup of most teenagers to challenge and or break rules, no matter how strict or broad they are, the sensible thing is to make rules initially quite strict and restrictive. Then, as the maturing child demonstrates that he can be trusted to behave appropriately, you can gradually allow him increased privileges with less and less parental control. In other words, his privileges will be contingent upon his showing you that he is trustworthy. There are many advantages to using this approach. First, it is wise to be in the position of being able to allow more privileges and not fewer. Your relationship with your teenager is better when you are able to be positive. It's less comfortable when you must be negative. When your teen is just beginning his adolescent career, especially his social life, if you begin by being somewhat over-restrictive, then you can afford to be positive and grant privileges. You can be the good guy. If you give all the privileges initially, you have nothing to work with. You have no way to reward your teen for taking increased responsibility. And worse, you have no means to train him to be trustworthy and learn the value of being responsible. Your goal in moving from restrictiveness to privilege is that your teenager will become a responsible, trustworthy, independent adult by the age of 18. It takes courage and determination to make your teenager's privileges strictly dependent upon his ability to control his own behavior. It takes strength to stand against the pressure for unearned concessions, not only from your teenager, but from other teenagers, other parents, and even society. But let me tell you one crucial fact. All teenagers at some level of consciousness realize they need guidance and control from their parents. They want it. I've heard so many teenagers say that their parents do not love them because they are not strict or firm enough. And so many teenagers express their thankfulness and love to parents who showed their care and concern by their guidance and control. Another factor to consider is that in order for a teenager to continue to develop a normal conscience and learn to behave responsibly as an adult, he must experience consequences for his behavior. Positive consequences for appropriate responsible behavior and negative consequences for inappropriate irresponsible behavior. These consequences must be consistent and fair and based on behavior, not on how the parent is feeling at the time. Again, we're back to facing the importance of parental self-control and making decisions based on clear, logical thinking rather than on our impulsive feelings. I believe that a rule or decision deserves a reason. A teenager is entitled to know why, and parents must be careful to be sure that the reason is practical and not simply moralistic. Of course, there may be moralistic reasons behind the rule, but there must also be a practical reason. Teenagers in early adolescence are in the midst of questioning their parents' rules and values, and these early teens relate much better to practical rules than to moralistic ones. One reason so many teenagers turn against spiritual values is that they are given too many moralistic reasons for rules and/or restrictions. Parents of teenagers need to be in good communication with parents of other teenagers, especially with the parents of the teenagers who are closest to their own teen. It is a priceless asset to be able to share information and concerns with other parents and to work together with them in providing direction and control for the young people. You should not be afraid to call the parent or adult sponsor to find out about planned activities. How else are you going to control and protect your teenage child? And when you do call, listen carefully to the attitude or tone of what that person tells you, since this usually conveys more than the actual words. For example, when the parent or adult sponsor actually sounds pleased and even thankful that you are calling regarding your teenager, that is a good sign. It's a wonderful thing to hear someone say how grateful they are that a parent cares enough about his child to find out what's going on. When I hear that, I thank God that there are still decent, loving, guiding parents in this world. Unfortunately, however, you may receive a different response. I remember calling a mother who was giving a party to which Carrie, then 15, was invited. This mother's response to my inquiry was hostile. She said, "This is a private party. Your daughter is invited and she can come or not. It's up to her, but what I do in my own house is my own business." From this response alone, I knew that her home was no place for my teenager. But I pressed her for details. I said, "I see, but I'm concerned about my daughter, and I'd really appreciate it if you'd fill me in on the details of your get-together." By now, the mother was angry, but with persistence, I was able to gather that the teenagers would be served wine and Bloody Marys in a sensually provocative atmosphere. This is commonplace today. You cannot sit back and assume your teenagers are experiencing wholesome influences simply because the activities may be supervised. Many influences today are not what you would want your teenager to be exposed to. You should keep two things in mind as you control and train your teenager. First, allow privileges based upon the trust relationship. Secondly, try to make sure your teenager can handle the particular situation before you allow him to go. Checking into the appropriateness of the situation does not mean you do not trust your teenager. Even though a teenager is trustworthy, means well, and has fine intentions, there are still situations he may not have the maturity to handle. In these cases, you must protect your teenager. A good example of this is the party to which Carrie was invited. Carrie was quite trustworthy. It was her genuine intention to act appropriately. But she was too young and immature at that time to handle such a heavy situation. When I told Carrie she could not go to this event, her natural reaction was, "Why not?" She carefully pointed out that her previous behavior had been exemplary, that she knew how to behave appropriately, that she definitely would do so, and that I could trust her. My reply to her was that she was absolutely right. I was truly proud of her, and I knew that I could trust her. However, I felt she was not yet ready or able to handle such a pressurized and difficult situation as this particular event. I was able to tell Carrie that I truly trusted her because of her previous good behavior. but there were certain situations she was not yet ready to handle, and some that any right-thinking person should avoid. At this point, let me insert some good advice. If you ever get into a situation where you do not feel comfortable about an upcoming event that your teenager wants to go to, yet you can't put your finger on the reason why, your best response is to delay. In this teenage world, events and situations change so fast that this type of problem usually takes care of itself. I can think of only one or two occasions when the problem did not somehow resolve itself. Another advantage of delay is that your teenager will have time to think it over and may come to some mature decisions himself. I remember once when Carrie was 15 years old that she was invited to spend the day on a large boat to swim during the day. Then at night there would be a party aboard the boat. My wife and I were having some tough thoughts about this one. The day activities certainly seemed all right, but the thought of the party that night somehow bothered us. We knew the parents who would supervise the party were sensible people. I said, "Let me think it over." And Carrie said, "Okay, but hurry, I have to know by Thursday." Much to my chagrin, the situation had not resolved itself. The questionable event was still on. The weather forecast was excellent, and it was Thursday evening already, with Carrie saying in an irritated voice, "What's your answer, Daddy? Greg has to know tonight." I had a terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach because I couldn't think of any legitimate reason to say no. Carrie's behavior had been exemplary. Just as I was ready to give her permission to go, she said, "Daddy, by the way," remember those critical words? "Greg can't get his folks' car to go to the party. We have to go in his dune buggy, you know, the one with no seat belts, and we have to cross the bridge during the 5 o'clock traffic." I'm surely glad I was listening closely at that moment, for I immediately responded, "I'm sorry, but you may not go to the party." Carrie did not even ask why, but went directly to the phone, called Greg, and said, "I'm sorry, I can't go to the party. My father won't let me." Many times a teenager will give clues when he wants or needs a no to a question or privilege. You must listen closely for these clues, for they usually occur when your teenager needs a way out of a difficult peer situation. When he can use you as a defense or alibi in such a situation, this produces a wonderful sense of camaraderie between you and your teenager. The most healthy attitude is to work hand in hand with your teenager toward his being a responsible, independent person by the time he's at the legal age of adulthood. If you clearly state this to your teenager so he understands that you actually want him to be independent within a given time and are working toward that end, he can then feel you are for him and not against him. A teenager needs to be reminded of his partnership from time to time, especially when he wants to go places where his parents feel is inappropriate. For example, let's say that your teenager wants to go to a party which you've checked out and feel is inappropriate for him. You find that you must say no, and you find that your teenager simply will not or cannot accept it. This is a good time to use the strategy I mentioned. I have found it to be very effective in helping the teenager to gain perspective, to understand that his parents are working on his behalf and not trying to hold him back from gaining his independence. In my experience, this difficult time seems to occur most frequently when a teenager is 16. He has recently gotten his driver's license, which feeds his urge for new experience. How forceful you need to be with this strategy depends on the specific situation. I remember counseling parents of a 16-year-old boy who was utterly determined to go to a concert which was obviously unwholesome. I advised these fine parents to be pleasant but firm at this time as they explained to their teenager that they wanted him to become independent and to be able to make his own decisions as soon as he was able. In only 18 months, he would legally be an adult, and after that date, he could be expected to handle his own affairs, make his own living, find his own place to live, do his own laundry, cooking, etc. If these facts still do not give your teenager perspective, they do in the majority of cases, and he remains oppositional, you may go further and state that you have no legal responsibility for him after he is 18, that you intend to do everything in your parental power to get him ready for adult life in the next 18 months, because your legal responsibility ends at that time. This strategy is a rather harsh thing to do, teenagers, and should only be used as a last resort in difficult circumstances. However, teenagers need to be aware that the parent's overall intention is to indeed prepare them for responsible independence and adulthood, not to hold them back. You can reinforce this attitude in several ways. For example, providing your teenager with his own checking account, placing monthly deposits into it, and teaching him to be responsible for certain expenses is an excellent way to foster an attitude of cooperation between you and your teen in working toward his independence. Another way is, during times of good communication, to talk about his future, what he wants to do after high school, what vocation he might consider, whether college is right for him, and if so, which one. Looking at colleges with your teenager is a very effective means of fostering a feeling of cooperation. Providing any new experience for your teenager, such as a new sport or hobby, also helps accomplish this. A question frequently raised by parents is how much restriction to impose on a teenager for misconduct. Teenagers, like all children, have an acute sense of fairness. They know when parents are permissive and when they are too harsh or unreasonable. Common sense must prevail. Lesser misbehavior, such as coming in 15 minutes late after a date, warrants restrictions of less than a week. If it recurs, then the restriction must be lengthened. Restrictions longer than 2 weeks are seldom warranted, with 4 weeks as an extreme outside limit. If restrictions are frequent, especially in ranges greater than 1 week, something is wrong, possibly in the parent's expectation, the parent-child relationship, or other possibilities which we will discuss later. Above all, remember that well-loved teenagers are so much easier to discipline and control than those who are not so loved. We must keep their emotional tanks full. Another point to be aware of is the great importance of parents being considerate and pleasant to their teenagers' peers. They should be cordial, regardless of their feelings toward them. Many needless problems arise as a direct result of parental hostility toward adolescent peers. Remember, parents are authority figures. Most teenagers will consequently pity and side with a peer who's being ill-treated by a parent, regardless of the situation. Being civil to anyone, including your teenager's peers, definitely pays off. First of all, your teenager will appreciate it and can feel free to bring other teenagers home. Secondly, other teens often are having problems communicating with their parents. Many times they are seeking other adults to relate to. It is a wonderful privilege to befriend your teenager's friends. Not only does this help them, but it draws your own teen closer to you. Thirdly, when you treat unwholesome peers kindly, you avoid pushing your teenager toward them. In fact, what usually happens in such a case is that your teenager will later approach you with questions regarding his peers. He will want your opinion about his friends. Then your teenager will listen to your opinion of his peers. But if you are hostile toward his friends, your teenager usually will avoid discussing that issue with you, and you in turn will have lessened your influence on your child. What we've talked about thus far bears upon normal situations. However, there are times when parents are not facing normal problems. If a teenager, despite unconditional love and appeals to reason from parents, is continually difficult to manage, it is likely that he has more serious problems and needs outside help. Since behavioral problems in teenagers are becoming more and more common and increasingly complex, a wise parent will seek help early before they become serious. Most problems can be handled effectively by competent, well-trained therapists, along with cooperation from the parents. Chapter 9, Adolescent Depression. A short time ago, an anxious mother called me regarding her 14-year-old son. She was not sure if her son needed help. This loving mother said her boy was acting normally, looked normal, and talked normally, that everything seemed fine, except that every evening after watching the news, he would say something like this: "Things are getting so bad in the world, I wonder if it would be better to be dead." This fine boy was found to be moderately depressed. Adolescent depression is a complex, subtle, and dangerous phenomenon. It is complex because of its many complicated causes and effects. It is subtle because it almost always goes undetected, even by the teenager, until a tragedy occurs. It is dangerous because depression can result in the worst of happenings, from school failure to suicide. Teenage depression is difficult to identify because its symptoms are different from the classical symptoms of adult depression. For example, a teenager in mild depression acts and talks normally. There are no outward signs of depression. In moderate depression also, the teenager acts and talks normally. However, in moderate depression, the content of the teenager's speech is affected, dwelling primarily on depressing subjects such as death, morbid problems, and crises. Since many adults today seem to dwell on pessimistic trains of thought, the teenager's depression may go unnoticed. In the vast majority of cases, only in severe depression does the teenager actually appear depressed. When we can say, "Boy, does that kid look depressed," we should assume that that teenager is profoundly depressed and probably suicidal. There is an exception to this, however. Teenage depression is difficult to identify because teenagers are good at masking it. That is, they can cover it by appearing okay even when they are absolutely miserable. This is often called smiling depression. This is a front which teenagers employ unconsciously. This masking of depression is done primarily when other people are around. When depressed teenagers are alone, they let down or relax the mask somewhat. This is helpful to parents. If we are able to see our teenagers at times when they believe no one is looking at them, they may be able to identify depression. The best way to identify depression in a teenager is to understand the various symptoms manifested in teenage depression and how they develop. Let's look at specific symptoms of adolescent depression. Symptom 1, shortened attention span. The teenager is not able to keep his mind focused on a subject as long as he once could. This shortening of attention span usually becomes obvious when the teen attempts to do his homework. He finds it harder and harder to keep his mind on it, and it seems that the harder he tries, the less he accomplishes. Of course, this leads to frustration, as the teenager then blames himself for being stupid or dumb. Imagine what this does to his self-esteem. Symptom 2, daydreaming. The shortened attention span affects the teenager in the classroom. At first, he may be able to pay attention to the classwork for most of the period and then daydream the remaining minutes. As the depression deepens and the attention span becomes shorter, the teenager pays attention less and daydreams more. At this point, his teacher is in the best position to identify depression. Unfortunately, daydreaming is usually interpreted as laziness or poor attitude. Symptom 3, poor grades. As the teenager's attention span shortens and his daydreaming increases, the natural result is lower grades. Unfortunately, this falling of grades is usually so gradual that it's difficult to notice. For this reason, it's seldom associated with depression. In fact, the teenager, the parents, and the teacher usually assume that the work is too difficult for the teenager or that he's becoming more interested in other things. Symptom 4, boredom. As the teenager daydreams more and more, he gradually falls into a state of boredom. Normal boredom is frequently seen for an hour or two, sometimes for an entire evening or day, or occasionally even 2 days. But prolonged boredom, several days or more, is not normal and should be a warning to us that something is not right. Few things worry me as much as prolonged boredom in an adolescent, especially an early adolescent. The bored teenager loses interest in things which he or she once enjoyed. For example, sports, clothes, cars, hobbies, clubs, church and social activities, and dating. Symptom 5, somatic depression. As the boredom continues and deepens, the teenager gradually slips into moderate depression. At this point, he begins to suffer from what I call somatic depression. The symptoms begin to affect the child in a directly physical way. For example, in moderate depression, the teenager begins to experience physical pain. Many teenagers suffer pain in the lower chest and/or head, secondary to depression. Symptom 6, withdrawal. In this miserable state, the teenager may withdraw from peers. And to make matters worse, he doesn't simply avoid his peers, but may disengage himself from them with such hostility, belligerence, and unpleasantness that he alienates them. As a result, the teenager becomes very lonely, and since he has so thoroughly antagonized his good friends, he finds himself associating with rather unwholesome peers who may use drugs and/or are frequently in trouble. Once prolonged boredom has set in, many things can develop. The mental and physical pain at this stage may be excruciating and at times unbearable. Eventually, he becomes desperate enough to do something about his misery. Most amazingly, even at this point, the teenager is hardly ever aware that he is depressed. The teenager's ability to hide behind denial is truly incredible. This is why depression is seldom suspected until tragedy occurs. When a teenager has been moderately to severely depressed, to the extent that he can endure it no longer, he will take action in an attempt to alleviate his misery and distress. Boys tend to be more violent than girls. They may attempt to relieve their depressive symptoms by stealing, lying, fighting, driving fast, or through other types of antisocial behavior. One of the most common kinds of criminal behavior seen today among boys is breaking and entering. Doing something which has an air of excitement and danger to it seems to somewhat relieve the pain of depression. Girls tend to act out their depression in less violent ways. However, because of unhealthy, violence-oriented models in the media, this trend is changing. Girls frequently act out their depression by sexual promiscuity. Their depressive pain tends to be alleviated during the close physical relationship of intercourse. However, when the act is over, these unfortunate girls feel worse, more depressed than before because of the self-degradation involved. Depression and low self-esteem are almost always the basis of a girl's promiscuity. A depressed teenager can also act out his depression by taking drugs. Marijuana and depression are a very dangerous combination because marijuana blocks the pain of depression. Unfortunately, the teenager feels better simply because he does not hurt as much. Of course, when the marijuana is out of his system, the depressive pain returns. Another way a depressed teenager may act out his depression is by attempting suicide. Sometimes the attempt is a gesture in which the teenager does not wish death but attention. At other times, there is a genuine attempt to die. Girls make many more suicide attempts than boys, but boys are more often successful in killing themselves. What can we do to help our depressed teenagers? First of all, we must identify depression early in order to prevent tragedy. This means we must be familiar with symptoms of adolescent depression. People who need this information most are parents and those who work with teenagers, such as teachers, school counselors, and youth workers. When the depression is identified early, that is, when the depression is mild, it is relatively easy to halt insidious progress and alleviate it. Although most adolescent depression is complex in its underlying causes, often there is a specific factor or event which finally overwhelms. For example, a death or illness, or departure of a person important to the teenager, a disappointment such as a divorce or conflict between parents, or a move to an undesired place. It feels lonely, abandoned, and unloved. Adolescent depression is not something you can consider a phase that will run its course. This insidious affliction tends to grow worse and worse unless the depression is identified and intervention is taken. What is more frightening than people who cannot think accurately and have distorted ideas, distorted views, and distorted values? Are you willing to make sure your teenager gets through adolescence without his intellectual, social, and psychological assets being harmed or destroyed? If so, you will love your teenager, take close care of, and appropriately supervise him. It's a difficult job, but the reward is well worth the cost. Seeing your teenager developing into a mature, sensitive, independent, right-thinking adult, contributing to his world, is one of life's greatest rewards. Chapter 10, Helping Your Teenager Intellectually. To prepare your adolescents for the future in this world of non-reason, you must teach them to think clearly. A person cannot have a strong, consistent, lasting faith or a moral value system without being able to think clearly. One of the best pieces of armament you can give your child is the ability to evaluate his own thinking so that he can have confidence in it and be able to modify it in the light of new knowledge. In addition, he should learn to see errors in faulty thinking and understand how false conclusions are reached. A child develops intellectually from one phase to another. The factor which most determines how well a child masters each stage of thought development is the degree of emotional nourishment he receives. The more your child feels loved, the more he will be able to learn to think clearly and logically. The less a child feels loved and cared for, the weaker his mind will be. Recently, I saw a muscularly built 14-year-old boy who had attacked his baseball coach with a bat and injured him. The boy felt totally justified in this act. He stated that he had the right to attack his coach because he and the coach's son were competing for the same position, and this put him at a disadvantage. The poor reasoning that this boy expressed is called loose association. By using loose association in the thought process, a person can justify almost anything. Such confused thinking is illogical and dangerous, and it is becoming more and more common among our teenagers today. You should be constantly alert for opportunities to teach your teenager to make accurate associations in his thinking. Typical adolescent cannot think abstractly to a significant degree until he is at least 15 years old, and then he is just learning. This is why a teenager is often sure his parents are wrong or ignorant during his early and middle adolescence. Later, as his thought processes mature and he becomes capable of abstract reasoning, he begins to understand his parents and respect their opinions. You need to be patient and loving during these difficult times and gently train your teenager to think clearly. Many parents make the mistake of only correcting their teenagers, but a teen will feel competent. He receives approval, validation, and praise, as well as correction. You can give these priceless assets to your teenagers only if you engage them intellectually. This means being available to discuss with any subject they want to talk about. This means being willing to listen to their ideas and to fully hear them out, regardless of your own reactions. Then, instead of directly pointing out their mistakes or arguing with them, you can discuss the issues with respect, seriously considering their viewpoint and calmly expressing your own. Such conversation should resemble talk between good friends. In doing this, you are not giving up your parental authority. You are simply showing respect for your teenager's thinking. You are letting thoughts and opinions are worthy and valuable. Unfortunately, too many parents refuse to talk with their teenagers in a give-and-take manner. Instead, they persist in talking down to their teenagers as though they were small children. Only when your teenager sees that you are willing to relate to him as a responsible person with a mind of his own will he feel balanced confidence in his ability to learn to think clearly and to grow to intellectual maturity. Let me give you one example that involves the intellectual training of our son David. David knows which TV programs his mother and I approve of and which ones we don't. And he is usually quite good in complying with our wishes regarding his TV viewing. One evening, however, he was watching a program we don't like, Love. When I reminded David that I did not want him to watch it, he asked, "Why not?" And then said he could see nothing wrong with it because no one is getting hurt. It was very tempting for me to jump on David and criticize him for this shallow and immature way of thinking. But thank goodness I remembered that he needs intellectual affirmation and training to learn to think maturely. So I said, "I understand what you mean, David, but I think Love Boat is hedonistic and narcissistic." That got his attention. He replied, "What does that mean?" I said, "Tell you what, David, let's get a dictionary and look these words up." Incidentally, using the dictionary has been a tremendous help to me in teaching my children difficult concepts. We looked the words up together. Then we talked about the meaning of hedonistic and narcissistic until I was sure he understood them. But like a typical developing early adolescent, after David understood the definitions, he still did not understand how they related to real life. I said, "David, do you think a hedonistic and narcissistic person would make a good husband, wife, mother, or father? How about your mother? Is she selfish? Does she care only about herself, with little regard for others? Is she only concerned about her own pleasure and not in anyone else's welfare?" This certainly turned on a light in David's head. He thought about all the things his loving mother had done for him that day, even though she did not feel well. I was overjoyed when David finally replied, "This means that a selfish person is interested only in getting pleasure for himself instead of caring about other people." Then David and I talked about how Love Boat displayed selfish, self-gratifying attitudes with little regard for the welfare of the other person. Teaching a teenager to think clearly is difficult, time-consuming, and tedious. But if you do not clarify issues, such as those just described, those attitudes will subtly influence your teenager. One reason teenagers are confused about moral issues is that many parents are not assuming responsibility for teaching their own convictions to their children. Other parents say they believe in spiritual values, but they do not live them. Nothing is more confusing to a teenager than inconsistency in the life of the parent. How can parents teach their teenagers to think clearly about moral and spiritual values if their own lives do not demonstrate the results of clear thinking? I believe that the undisciplined behavior which is destroying the moral fiber of our society must be dealt with. Surely God will judge us for the lack of discipline and self-control in the lives of so many who call themselves Christian. Fellow parents, let's get our own lives in order, consistently behaving as we know God wants us to. Then we can claim God's promises to us for our children. Chapter 11, Helping Your Teenager Spiritually. Today's generation of teenagers is often called the apathetic generation. Why do they lack initiative and incentive? Essentially, it's because they have little hope in the future. The prevailing mood in our young today is hopelessness, helplessness, and despair. As parents, we wonder how this heartbreaking situation can be possible. It seems as if the very heart and soul have been torn from so many of our precious teenagers. Why do they have so little hope in the future? The attitudes and moods of a nation's youth reflect the attitudes and moods of its adults. What are our youth reflecting from adults? They are reflecting depression, gloom, hopelessness, and despair. How can a teenager react positively in such an atmosphere? A teen needs to see something positive and worthwhile in life to rally behind. We of the older generation seem to be offering our young people some strange and unhealthy attitudes which are largely untrue and certainly not scriptural. I can understand an unbeliever feeling this disorientation, confusion, and despair. But I find it difficult to understand the Christian person being in this trap of hopelessness. And yet I see so many Christians yielding to pessimistic influences. And I see their teenagers failing to find that critical, peace-giving anchor of hope which Christ intends for his people. I would like our teenagers to receive messages of hope, encouragement, and challenge. But our generation has generally lost contact with its spiritual heritage. Pessimism is not the teaching of Christ. His message is one of hope and joy. We are to watch for his coming and to pray. We are not to give up or be pessimistic about the future. We are not to withdraw from our moral responsibility to live godly lives and to pass our values on to our children. But to give our teenagers hope, faith, and optimism, we must live it. Initially, a child looks to his parents for guidance in life. Whether the child is successful in finding this from his parents depends on two things: whether his parents have found direction for themselves, and whether the child can accept parental values and make them his own. A child who is not able to feel genuinely loved by his parents will find this difficult. Let's examine this first requirement in providing the meaning to life a young person so desperately needs. We parents need a foundation on which we base our own lives and which can stand the test of time. A foundation which will see us through every part of life, through marital needs, money crises, problems with our children, energy shortages, and clashes within a changing society where spiritual standards are rapidly weakening. We parents must possess that foundation to be able to pass it on to our children. This priceless, comfort-providing, peace-giving treasure, which every heart needs, is a person. He gives strength in times of stress, yet offers comfort in times of sadness. He grants us wisdom when we are confused, yet corrects us when we are wrong. He gives commands to be carried out, but promises wonderful rewards for obedience. At times, he allows losses, distress, and pain, but he always gives us something better. He does not force us to do his will, but is painfully disappointed when we do the wrong thing. He desires that we love him, because he first loved us. but He allows us a free will to choose Him or reject Him. He wants to take care of us, but refuses to force Himself upon us. His greatest desire is to be our Father, but He will not intrude. If we want what He wants, a loving, caring, father-child relationship with Him, we must accept His offer. Of course, as you have guessed, He must be a personal God. This personal, intimate relationship with God through His Son, Jesus Christ, is the most important thing in life. This is the something which our young people are yearning for, the meaning of life, something to count on, something to bring comfort when everything seems to be falling apart. It is all there. Do you have it? If you do not, seek help from a minister or a Christian friend. The second requirement is that a child identify with his parents so that he can accept and incorporate their values. As you recall, if a teenager does not feel loved and accepted, he has real difficulty identifying with his parents and tends to react to parental guidance with anger, resentment, and hostility. In order for a teen to identify with his parents, relate closely with them, and be able to accept their standards, he must feel genuinely loved and accepted by them. It is extremely difficult for teenagers who do not feel unconditionally loved by their parents to feel loved by God. A very important thing to know about a teenager is how his memory operates. Remember that a teenager is a child emotionally and is much more emotional than cognitive. He therefore retains feelings much more readily than facts. For example, a child or teenager in a Sunday school class will remember exactly how he felt long after he forgets what was said or taught. So in some ways, whether a child's experience was pleasant or unpleasant is much more important than the details of what a teacher taught. If religious training is a degrading or boring experience for a young person, he is likely to reject even the best teaching, especially if morality and ethics are involved. On the other hand, if the learning experience is a pleasant one, a teenager's memories of religious things will be pleasant and can then be incorporated into his personality. Emotionality and spirituality are not entirely separate entities. One is quite related to and dependent on the other. For this reason, if parents want to help a child spiritually, they must care for him emotionally. I would like to examine a popular misconception that goes something like this. I want my child to learn to make his own decisions after he is exposed to things. He shouldn't feel he has to believe what I believe. I want him to learn about different religions and philosophies. Then, when he has grown up, he can make his own decision. This parent is either avoiding the issue or is grossly ignorant of the world we live in. A child brought up in this manner is to be pitied. Without continual guidance and clarification in ethical, moral, and spiritual matters, he will become increasingly confused about his world. There are reasonable answers to many of life's conflicts and seeming contradictions. One of the finest gifts parents can give a child is a clear understanding of the world and its confusing problems. How do parents prepare their teenagers spiritually? Organized religious instruction and activities are extremely important to a developing child or teenager. However, nothing influences a teenager more than his home and what he is exposed to there. Parents need to be actively involved in a teenager's spiritual growth. They cannot afford to leave it to others, even superb church youth workers. First, parents must teach their teenagers spiritual concerns. It is quite simple to give teenagers basic scriptural facts, such as who different Bible persons were and what they did. But that is not what we are after ultimately. For we want teenagers to understand what meaning biblical characters and principles have for them personally. We must be willing to spend time alone with our teenagers in order to provide for their emotional needs as well as spiritual needs. Secondly, parents must share their own spiritual experiences. With the factual knowledge gained from church, Sunday school, and home, a teenager only has the raw material with which to grow spiritually. He must learn to use this knowledge effectively and accurately to become a mature person spiritually. The best way to help a teen with this is to share your own spiritual life with him. Keep him informed about how God is working in your life and how He is using you to minister to someone. And of course, Your teenager should certainly know you are praying for him and for his particular needs. Third, parents should be examples of forgiveness. A teenager must be taught by example how to forgive and how to find forgiveness, both from God and people. Parents do this first of all by forgiving. Next, when they make a mistake which hurts a teenager, they admit the mistake, apologize, and ask his forgiveness. I cannot overstress how important this is. My pastor told me a story about a friend of his who, when he was trying to deal with his own tendencies toward discouragement and despair, would let his balcony people speak to his cellar voices. The cellar voices in all of us come from the basements of our lives. They proceed from the dark side of ourselves, a dark side that most folks rarely see. The cellar is where our scenarios of hate, greed, pride, lust, and destruction are formed. And woe to that person who does not recognize the potency of this area. The cellar voices also come from those around us who, because of low self-esteem, guilt, frustration, or pent-up hostility, cut us down, telling us how bad the world is and how bad we are. If we let them, these cellar voices can lead us to despair and hopelessness. But fortunately, my pastor's friend also told him about balcony people. These are the people, living and dead, who have lifted us with their love, faith, hope, and courage. We all need balcony people who show us that we can live above the petty and discordant levels of life. The balcony people speak to us both with their talk and their walk. Our teenagers need balcony people to give them hope. They are hearing more than enough cellar voices. We must be balcony people to our precious youth. But we must work at it. We do not have to be spreaders of gloom and doom. Oh, how very sensitive our teenagers are to pessimism, especially from their parents. God gives us hope. Hope is not wishful thinking. Hope is the knowledge that the wonderful promises of God are true. There are thousands of promises God has made to us. Read them for yourselves. Start with Romans 8:28, or Jeremiah 29:11, or Isaiah 41:10, or Psalm 34:19. There must be recovery of hope in our land. Our young people need hope to face an uncertain future. I know the situation does not look good right now. We must give them confidence, courage, moral strength, and a sense of responsibility. But we cannot give them these priceless assets without hope, the sure knowledge that God exists, that He loves us, and that His promises are true. Christian hope is not dependent on what the world does to us. It is dependent on what we do in the world as we live in response to God's great love for us. Fellow parents, it is hard to be a balcony person in the 1980s. But by working at it every day, we will gradually become more and more like Christ, the ultimate balcony person. Chapter 12, The Older Adolescent. As adolescents near the time of normal separation from home, they still need their parents to help them make that precarious crossing into adulthood. Contrary to what many parents assume, this crossing does not happen instantaneously through a high school graduation or a move out of the house. The transition into adulthood should be a gradual weaning process for which both parents and teenager prepare. You need to increase your teenager's self-sufficiency by making sure he can actually take care of himself. Can he do his own laundry? Cook balanced meals for himself? Handle all the other necessities for independent living? These needs are usually overlooked, especially with boys. I have known many instances of a boy living away from home for the first time, fixing the same unhealthy, starchy meal over and over to the point of developing vitamin deficiencies and becoming susceptible to illness. By the time your adolescent becomes independent, he should be able to handle his own finances. This means budgeting his income and balancing his checkbook. Self-discipline is best learned before leaving home. Seldom is it sufficiently learned later. One of the most important aspects of a teenager's personality is his degree of goal orientation. No one, and especially a teenager, is perfectly balanced in this area of being goal-oriented. It is fine to be goal-oriented and conscientious. But people who are excessively so will tend to find life a drudgery with little pleasure. If your older adolescent has these traits, you can be of tremendous help to him by teaching him to find significance in pleasant hobbies and other means of relaxation, and especially to learn the immense value of friends and personal relationships. The more a teenager sees the meaning and value of human relationships, the more he will develop into a pleasant, congenial person who can roll with life's punches without crippling depression. The key is balance. You want your older adolescent to have the essential degree of goal orientation to enable him to have a life of satisfying accomplishments. But you also want him to be person-oriented so that he can have truly meaningful personal relationships as a spouse, parent, and friend. You may have a teenager who is capable of making good grades, but who's having so much fun in activities and with friends that he doesn't give proper time and effort to academics. It is appropriate to handle this problem directly. If you have done your job as a parent, making sure your teenager feels unconditional love, you have every right and responsibility to directly enforce your teenager to take the proper amount of responsibility and become properly goal-oriented. One of the most difficult dilemmas that we parents face today is the preparation of our young people to handle the real world with its alcohol and other drugs, sexual license, decaying spiritual values, and general attitude of meism or selfishness. I believe it is a cruel blunder to completely isolate children and teenagers from the world as it really is. But I have seen many parents do this. Eventually, of course, they must let their sons or daughters go. If our young people have not learned how to deal with these pressures while living at home, how can they cope with real life when they are on their own? While your teenager is living at home, under its haven of safety and guidance, he needs some exposure to these problem areas in a controlled way. Of course, I don't mean encouragement or permission to live it up for the experience. I mean training your teenager how to cope with real life, and setting privileges based on trust, consequences of behavior, and appropriateness of the social occasion. These privileges should be controlled to progress in such a way that you can help your teenager handle different encounters as they arrive. One of the most serious mistakes you can make is to assume that school, church, or other organizations can or will handle this part of your child's development for you. The parent has the greatest effect on the teenager, especially regarding values and lifestyle. Schools and churches can help, but without the primary involvement of the parent, the teenager will not usually do well. Although our adolescents are nearing adulthood, their emotional needs have changed little since childhood. Even at this stage, they need to know that we genuinely love them, that we are available, and that we will help them in any way we can for their own good. One problem for many parents at this point is the old enemy, anger. Some parents who handled anger well when their adolescents were younger have a real problem handling it at this critical point. We must remember that this final separation is difficult for our teens. It is a long, weaning process during which time we must remain available to offer support and help. Even after our young person leaves home, he still needs us. He needs to know we are there, available, and ready to help when needed. A common characteristic of departing young ones is their need for everything to remain the same, just the way they left it. This helps the young person feel secure. It's a good idea to keep as many things as possible the same, especially rooms and personal possessions. However, the most important anchor of security a teen leaves behind is the marital relationship of parents. One of the most devastating things that can happen to an adolescent soon after leaving home is the separation or divorce of his parents. In most cases, the young person will be burdened with heavy guilt. Regardless of how unreasonable it may sound, the young person feels that he is somehow responsible, either for the bad marriage or for the divorce. If a divorce is inevitable, it is far better that it take place long enough before the adolescent leaves home so that he can work through the natural feelings of loss and grief with help of parents, friends, and minister before he takes on the difficult task of leaving home for the first time. I know one young man, John, who believed that his parents were happy in their marriage when he left for college. Within 3 months, they were divorced. The mother remarried soon afterward and sold the family house. John seldom goes home because it's so depressing for him. His base of security has been destroyed. You can imagine what this has done to his sense of well-being. Another important factor as children leave is that they stay involved with sources of security, stability, and growth. One of these is the church. It is important not only to attend church regularly with our children and teenagers, but to do all we can to make the church experience pleasant for them. A good youth group is critical, especially for the teen years. As our children move to college or work, we need to encourage them to become involved in church and Christian activities. One of my priorities as a parent is to make sure each of my children can identify the qualities that are desirable in a future spouse. It is not easy for a teenager to identify traits within a peer which indicate the ability to be a good spouse or parent. One of the first things I taught Carrie about this matter was to look at the character of a boy as well as to consider the feelings he produced in her. I explained to her that the best indicator of how he will treat his wife after marriage is the way he presently treats persons whom he is not required to treat with consideration, those who are elderly, unpleasant, or helpless. I told her to observe how he treated people in service jobs, such as waiters and waitresses. A third consideration, and the one Carrie really latched onto, was to see how he treated and related to children, especially small ones. For you see, Carrie has 2 younger brothers, providing a perfect litmus. Before I gave her these insights, she used to make sure David and Dale were out of sight before a date arrived. After our discussion, Carrie would ask David and Dale to answer the door and talk with her date while she got ready. It was interesting to watch Carrie observe her date from a hidden place to see how he did with her brothers. Our discussion has truly helped Carrie gain priceless insight into the boys she dates. Another characteristic of a person who will be a good spouse or parent is his ability to reason. If a person can reason, he usually has the ability to come to an agreement or compromise in family conflict. On the other hand, a person who cannot reason will almost invariably be unreasonable. He will be unable to argue, that is, explain his viewpoint in a conflict, and will probably demand his own way. Another indicator, which is extremely important but difficult to discern, is a person's ability to manage ambivalence. Ambivalence is having opposite feelings toward the same person. This person cannot see that there is good and bad, pleasant and unpleasant, in everyone. We all have ambivalent feelings. Handling them well, on a conscious level, is an indicator of maturity. Another good way to determine what kind of spouse or parent a person will be is to watch how he gets along with and treats his own parents, brothers, sisters, grandparents, other relatives, and longtime friends. This is an excellent indication of how he will treat his spouse and children in the future. In our discussions about our young people, we've talked about some painful things. But we've also talked about how we can and should be optimistic and hopeful about our teenagers and their future. My strongest desire is to see my children and yours grow into strong, healthy, happy, and independent adults. Some of the material in these chapters may be difficult to fully grasp the first time you hear this tape. I strongly suggest that you listen again soon and let the material come together for you in your particular circumstances. We need to be continually reminded how to really love our teenagers.